Well, that was an incredible introduction. I love working with you and YouthLink Scotland and everyone on the call. I think youth work is absolutely incredible in Scotland. We should be hugely proud of the work that you are all doing. The topic of today's policy convention is very dear to my heart. Youth work is human rights work. And the program that we have today is going to be amazing. I've got the best job in the world as the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland. I work directly with young people all across Scotland in their communities, climbing trees, playing on the floor with the paints and the glitter, singing and dancing, marching and campaigning. It's what children and young people asked me to do, to come to their communities, to find out what was important to them, and then work with them to be human rights defenders and help change the world. It's work that will be hugely familiar to all of you because it's youth work, and youth work's human rights work. It's that simple. It's important that we recognize that children and young people don't have the same political power as adults. They don't have the same economic power as adults to influence and lobby, to access systems of redress. And therefore, it's incumbent upon all of us to make special efforts to make sure that children's rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled, and to ensure that children can develop to their fullest potential and that they are recognized as essential parts of the communities we live in. I actually finished my mandate as Children's Commissioner in 6 months' time, and the Parliament will soon be beginning the process to select the next Commissioner. I strongly encourage all of you to consider this role. It is the best job in the world, and the skills and experience that come from the youth work sector would be invaluable in taking rights forward as the next Commissioner. I don't want to dwell on it too much because it makes me really sad that I have to step down from this role, but I really do want you to think about who the next Commissioner should be, and I think youth work skills would be an important part of that role. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is special. There are a lot of international human rights laws which protect the rights of children, but the Convention on the Rights of the Child is special. It was the first legally binding international law that brought all children's rights together: economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights, elements of humanitarian law and environmental law. And it starts with the idea that every child and young person on the planet should grow up in a family environment of happiness, love, and understanding. And when I think back to the video that we all saw at the beginning of this conference, those were the words that the young people were using: love, family, understanding, safety. Human rights work is youth work is human rights work. The rights framework is embedded through youth work practice in Scotland and internationally, and a huge welcome to our international guests. But I think Scotland really plays incredible leadership in placing human rights right at the heart of youth work. The Convention on the Rights of the Child really changed the way that we saw children in international human rights terms, away from this idea that children are passive objects of charity, but rather human beings with distinct rights right from birth. And the human rights framework has consistently focused on the importance of putting the scaffolding and support around children and young people, those trusted professional relationships from the voluntary sector, from on a voluntary basis, on a professional basis, the third sector, public sector. It's about making sure that there's those supported relationships around children throughout childhood and throughout youth. Ensuring that children are protected from harm and neglect and abuse, but also ensuring the positive obligations in relation to an adequate standard of living, a safe, warm home, nutritious food, those things that we know that are really essential, and those things that I'm hugely concerned about at the moment. Poverty is the biggest human rights issue facing children and young people in Scotland at the moment, and youth work has been central in addressing it as a human rights issue, but there are government failures at every level. Allowing poverty to continue in Scotland and in the UK is a political failure, and it's a breach of children's most basic rights. And youth work's been playing an incredible job, but we need governments at all levels to really step up and address poverty as a rights issue. Children also have the right to the highest attainable standard of health, and we know physical and particularly mental health has suffered significantly over recent years. Youth work plays an essential role in supporting children to access that highest attainable standard of mental health. Children and young people consistently talk to me about youth work as being central to their mental health. We saw that in the video. We heard that at the National Youth Work Conference. the other week, children have spoken to me about youth work saving their lives, saving their mental health. The work that you do is human rights work. It speaks right to these core rights. Children and young people have the right to an education which develops them to their fullest potential. Schools, colleges, universities all have to play a role in that alongside early years, but it's not just what happens in schools, it's education that happens in the community. The development of children to their fullest potential is something that happens in every space within their lives. And the fact that youth work is able to get alongside children, particularly those that aren't thriving in a school environment, and support them to access this right to the highest attainable standard of health, the highest attainable standard of education, and an education which develops them to their fullest potential, is an absolutely essential part of youth work and human rights work. The extra care and protection for disabled children and care experienced children protected within the convention speaks again to some of the fantastic work that's being done by youth workers all across Scotland. And really importantly, the Convention on the Rights of the Child requires children's views to be part of decision-making, and that all decisions should be made in children's best interest. And those participation rights are really special. Children can't vote, they don't have the same economic power, but they have the right to be heard in decisions which affect them. And they can only access that right adequately when they are supported to do so. And youth work plays an essential role in ensuring children's participation rights. And you are a powerful voice in helping them speak truth to power, challenging those adults in power who aren't properly listening to children and young people, aren't taking children's best interest into account. That powerful voice of youth workers alongside young people is absolutely essential. But the Convention on the Rights of the Child also requires the use of available resources to the maximum extent possible to ensure that children's rights are fulfilled. And I think that there's real concern that needs to be discussed today in terms of the inadequate, unsustained funding for youth work. Recognition and funding of the essential human rights work that you do as youth workers is absolutely essential, and government at all levels is failing to properly do that. And that is a failure of the obligation under Article 4 of the Convention to use available resource to the maximum extent possible. We know how important human rights are to children. Some of you would have heard me talk before about the 7-word stories that children and young people produced for the 30th anniversary of the convention. And they said things like, "My rights are my armor to me," this protective element of rights. Rights are help before you even ask. This idea that rights aren't about charity. Rights are proactive. There's obligations on the adults around you to help you. And my rights are my power, freedom, and courage. Rights are empowering for children and young people. And that's what really spoke to me from the video, hot chocolate video at the beginning of our session, about how important youth work is to children and young people. My name's on the roof. That sense of space, that sense of ownership, that sense of family, that sense of support, that sense of love, these are human rights issues because they speak to a child's ability to access their rights, to participate, to be engaged. And we need to ensure that resources are used to ensure the maximum extent possible of those obligations. As the Minister mentioned in her speech earlier, we have got the Convention on the Rights of the Child being incorporated into Scots domestic law. The Parliament nearly 2 years ago unanimously passed that. We're now a year on from the Supreme Court asking for amendments to that legislation. It's hugely disappointing that on the day that the Parliament's debating Human Rights Day, the government motion doesn't even mention the UNCRC or the bill, and that we're still waiting for a timetable over a year after the bill. I'll come back to that point. But I'm hugely concerned by the delay. Every day of delay is another day children's rights aren't properly protected, and that you don't have the tools that you need to properly ensure children's rights, because UNCRC incorporation is the most important thing we can do to ensure that rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And YouthLink, youth workers, and the young people that you support were absolutely the forefront of the campaign for incorporation. You led this campaign, you championed it as amazing human rights defenders. And I'm very angry that we are now so far delayed and we keep getting excuses without action. Because having rights in law, helps us deliver this cultural shift, but also the shift in human rights budgeting, the making sure that you're properly recognized and you have the tools to do the work that you need to do as human rights defenders, as youth workers effectively. Because as youth workers, you are human rights defenders. You play a really significant role in accessing those rights, mental health and physical health, education, social and recreational rights as well, the rights that speak right to the development of children and the particular focus on those whose rights are most at risk, those living in poverty, young carers, disabled children and young people, LGBTQI young people, minority and ethnic communities. That role that you play as trusted adults, providing safe space and support for children and young people outside of their family relationships, youth work's human rights work. It's recognized throughout the international framework at the UN, at the European level as well. I've already spoken at previous youth work conferences, YouthLink conferences, about my huge gratitude that I have to all of you for your ongoing work to ensure children's rights. And never was that more true than during COVID and the ongoing impacts of COVID. You have saved children's lives. Children have told me that the youth workers around them, those safe, trusted relationships, those spaces that you created saved lives. And I really want you to reflect on that. I know that you get all that positive energy back from young people, but you have saved lives and you do that on a daily basis with the young people that you work with. And they recognize that. And I think it's important that you recognize that as well. And again, back to the hot chocolate video, that love, support, family. And so it's important that those in power recognize and support you properly. And as Taylor mentioned earlier, we are in very difficult times at the moment. The world is a scary place, and I've never seen it so bad in terms of poverty, in terms of the fact that the social unrest and the lack of a rights-based approach from government. We need to take a rights-based approach. I want to highlight some of the really important evidence that came out of the work done during the pandemic, because I think that really gives us a platform to build upon. And I think the youth work reports during the pandemic were hugely useful. The fact that recognition that the pandemic really disconnected many young people from the spaces where they accessed youth work and interrupted some of those important relationships, making it more difficult to access support, opportunities for social interaction and learning. And particularly those young people whose rights were already missed, already at risk, were particularly affected by that. And the way in which you adapted your approaches to recreate safe spaces online or in the physical world was really important. And the priority that you were able to put on relationships, on support for learning, on mental health and well-being, to really try and mitigate some of the impacts of the pandemic, are things that need to flow into policy and decision-making as we go forward. The fact that 83% of young people in the YouthLink report said that youth work had been important or very important to them during the pandemic speaks to the value of your work. And the fact that they focused on social interaction, health and well-being, but also on skills and achievement and youth participation, the link to human rights could not be more clear. And so I really want to reiterate some of the calls that you're already making and commit myself to help make sure that those in power live up to their obligations by looking at the regulations and legal structure that underpins youth work, the need for a real statutory basis to recognize the essential nature of youth work as human rights work, and putting a legal requirement ensuring that there is youth work embedded in to a rights-based approach to service delivery. The issue of resources is absolutely essential and should be at the forefront of the minds of decision makers, and certainly will be through my work in relation to ensuring the realization of that right in Article 4 of the Convention, to ensure that children receive the maximum use of available resources. And I think that that's a big topic of discussion, I think, that we have today about the rights-based approach to budgeting, focusing on the value that youth work brings and the preventative spend that it is. Because I think perhaps we've been poor in the past as rights advocates and perhaps even the youth work sector in being able to strongly trumpet or celebrate the huge economic savings that you make. The fact saving one child's life, improving children's mental health, providing children a safe space so that they're not getting into conflict with the law, getting alongside and supporting families. These things have huge economic consequences if they go wrong. And so the work that you're doing needs to be valued, not just for the work that you're doing now, but for the impact that it has over the lifetime of children and young people. And perhaps we need to be better at quantifying that and making sure that budgets are focused on that preventative spend. And I think also that the focus on the work that you do as human rights education is really, really important and will become more important as we incorporate the Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law. And I think that the work that youth workers have done provides huge leadership on that. We're coming up to Human Rights Day on Saturday, the 10th of December. It'll be the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And certainly it's a time where we need to recognize the huge impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had and the disproportionate effect that it's had on particular groups of children and young people, but also recognizing the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that that's had on children across Europe and Ukrainian children here in Scotland, but also the impact that that's then led to in the cost of living crisis, which has further disproportionately impacted those who were already at risk in terms of their human rights. And also the fact that we're in a climate emergency, which continues to have an impact on children's physical and mental health. These are hugely concerning times. And at the UK level, human rights are in grave danger of being eroded by the UK government and their attack on the Human Rights Act. And so a lot of the work that we're doing, and again, I think that you're doing an amazing job in championing, is the protection of the Human Rights Act, which directly incorporates the European Convention of Human Rights into our domestic law. We have to protect the Human Rights Act, which is now over 20 years old and has provided significant impact on changing the culture and understanding of human rights in Scotland. It's a key pillar of devolution and very much part of the fabric of the work that we do. It's the one piece of international human rights law that we have incorporated into our domestic law. And the fact that that's being attacked by the UK government is something hugely concerning, and youth work and your leadership has been really strong in challenging that. It provides a really important legislative platform for the work that we're doing. And in November, my office published a report on the Human Rights Act to the Scottish Parliament, calling for more action from the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government to oppose the UK government and their attack on the Human Rights Act, pointing out the important elements of the Human Rights Act on children's rights and development, and that strong link to youth work's important part of that. So I think we're in these really challenging times where the UK government is actively seeking to dismantle the human rights framework at the UK level, and at Scottish level, we're seeing delay. I welcome the Scottish Minister's commitment to a human rights bill at some stage in the future, but even that's been delayed another year before we're even seeing a consultation on that. It's many years away. And the delay on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think I'll reflect a little bit more on. Although I'm aware of time, I'll stop soon. The Scottish government's been really quick to condemn the UK government. We talk a good game on human rights in Scotland, but after years of action plans and leadership groups and task forces, we've recently delayed the consultation on new human rights law in Scotland. And without these laws, we really lack accountability, and we're not going to see the change that we need. But even worse for me, though, than the delay on the Scottish Government's human rights bill is the delay on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has already been passed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament nearly 2 years ago, over a year from the Supreme Court. When the Scottish Parliament unanimously passed the UNCRC Incorporation Scotland Bill in March 2021, we thought we'd achieve something monumental. We all celebrated, despite the fact the Scottish Government opposed immediate commencement and we were going to have to wait for 6 months. But 21 long months later, children's rights aren't protected in law. In October 2021, the Supreme Court ruled that some sections went beyond the Parliament's power and reconsideration was needed. Work could have been done in anticipation of that judgment, but failing that, we should have done it quickly afterwards. And we met with Scottish Government straight away, and they reaffirmed their commitment to the bill, and they promised urgency. We hoped it would be done by Christmas last year, or at least introduced back to Parliament. But Scottish Government prevaricated and delayed, and children's rights weren't protected in law. We hoped that it would be done by the 1-year anniversary of the bill being passed. Surely that was the time for government to live up to its promise to bring back the bill and incorporate the UNCRC. But Scottish Government prevaricated and delayed, and children's rights weren't protected in law. We hoped that it'd be done on the 1-year anniversary of the judgment. Surely after a whole year, now was the time Scottish Government would live up to its promise and bring back the bill and incorporate the UNCRC. But the Scottish Government prevaricated and delayed, and children's rights weren't protected in law. On World Children's Day last month, maybe now's the time, but Scottish Government prevaricated, delayed, and children's rights weren't protected in law. I've lost count of the number of times that children and young people, civil society, you as a group, youth work, youth leaders, have met with government, met with officials, spoke about it in parliamentary committees. But the Scottish Government continues to prevaricate and delay, and children's rights still aren't protected in law. And this afternoon, we've got a debate to mark Human Rights Day, and Scottish Government is being asked once again. Tonight, there's the Kilbrandon lecture, which many of you may be attending, from Anne Skelton, who's a UN Committee on the Rights of the Child member. She'll be asking the government again, and children are still waiting. And every day of prevarication and delay is another day that children's rights aren't protected. I do hope that we hear something different today from Scottish Government, but I am losing hope. And my job as Children's Commissioner, and your job as youth workers, isn't just to sit and hope. It's to raise our voices, support children and young people to raise theirs, and to speak truth to power. I've got huge respect for Christina McKelvey, and real admiration for the work that she's doing. But the continuing prevarication and delay is not something we can continue to accept. We need to move to putting rights into law, because only then are we going to have the tools to ensure that rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. Rights-based budgeting, the focus on the incredible human rights work that you do, protected in law. I think I'm gonna finish there, but I want to finish on a positive note. Youth work is human rights work. You should be hugely proud of the incredible life-saving, life-affirming, life-improving work that you do, the human rights work that you do every day. You step up every single day beside children and young people to support them, to ensure that their rights are fulfilled. And perhaps today is the day that the Scottish Government finally steps up, recognises you, supports you, and puts children's rights into law. Have an amazing day.